Hi, my name is Frank Chupka from District 7, and this is Scheduling 101. So let's get started with a definition. This is a definition that I made up. This is what CPM scheduling is to me. Basically, it's just a timeline where you have all these different time periods or activities, as we call them, and the activities control each other through relationships. This is an actual unretouched picture of a CPM schedule for FDOT. This is a Gantt chart, and this is what Amy Niedringhaus here in District 7 would call a hot mess. It's got a lot of stuff going on here, so if you're a newbie, don't let it intimidate you. We're going to take small bite-sized pieces, and if you can understand a small part of this, you pretty much know the whole thing. And here's a little bit of a close-up of the hot mess. Now let's talk about relationships. Not this kind of relationship. I'm far from being an expert on that kind of relationship. I'm talking about the relationship between activities and how they control each other. Here's a very simple example. Let's say we're building a house, and let's say it's just a very two-step house. We're going to build the walls and we're going to build the roof. There's a finish to start relationship between building the walls and building the roof, and this is because you have to finish building the walls before you can even start building the roof. Now, you don't necessarily have to start building the roof as soon as you finish building the walls, but you have to wait at least until that long in order to do this. And keep in mind that these activity bars that you see on the Gantt charts, remember on the hot mess you had those little bars, they're proportional to the length of time typically. Now, I have a sense that there's somebody out there, and we all know who this is. Let's for the sake of us let's call this person Mr. Know-It-All. He's saying, hey, if you're building a concrete block house, you've got to wait and let the mortar cure for at least 3 days before you build that roof. Well, as my cousin says, we have an app for that. The finish to start relationship with a 3-day lag. You'll probably hear about lag sometimes in CPM scheduling and scheduling reports, and that's what a lag is. Keep in mind that the total process from here to here now has been increased by 3 days, so you have to account for that. Okay, Captain Obvious just flew into the room, and the predecessor activity is the building of the walls because it happened before, and the successor event is the building of the roof because it happened after. You'll hear about predecessors and successors a lot in critical path method scheduling. Now let's say you want to make ice cream sundaes for all your friends and you're getting your friend to help you. Now it's not quite so obvious which one's the successor and which one is the predecessor. But suffice to say that if you're the one that's doing the scooping of the ice cream and your friend is placing the cherries, even though you're doing both things at the same time pretty much and you're overlapping, and by the way, in CPM, if you draw a straight line up and down, imaginary straight line, the things that are happening together are going to overlap. You'll hit both of them. You have to finish the last of your scooping just a moment before your friend finishes placing the cherries. Because you have to finish a moment before your friend, you are the predecessor scooping the ice cream, and the friend then becomes the successor. Now, I have a feeling Mr. Know-It-All is a little consternated again, and he's going, you know what? That's just all wrong. You can't put a round cherry on top of a round scoop of ice cream. It's going to fall off. You have to wait 20 minutes after the scoop to put the cherry on, so the ice cream gets kind of soft, and it'll sink down into the cherry a little bit. Well, I'm happy to say we have an app for that as well, and that's a finish-to-finish relationship with a lag of 20 minutes. This could also be done as a start-to-start relationship because your friend has to wait until after the first scoop you put down, your friend has to wait and put the first cherry down after 20 minutes. In this case, you kind of have like two competing relationships. And this is a made-up term. So because I'm not a real scheduling expert, I can just kind of make up terms on the fly. So if you do talk to a real expert and you talk about local float, they might look at you funny. But this is what it is. Basically, this says you have to wait at least 20 minutes before you start placing your cherries, but you could wait a longer amount of time up until this point. Remember, time is going from left to right. Here's a start-to-start relationship and a lag of 20 minutes without the finish-to-finish relationship over here on the other side. Most activities and events, they have relationships with several other activities and events. Okay. How many people wash clothes like this? How many people wash 3 loads of clothes and then finish and start and dry all 3 loads? Probably nobody. More likely your process looks like this. As soon as that first load is washed, you put it in the dryer and start the second load so that you're washing and drying at the same time for a certain amount of time. But notice at the beginning of time, of course, you're only washing, and this illustrates that. Okay, in DOT world, that's comparable to doing the survey and also doing the phase 1 plans, where you're not waiting until the survey is completely done to start the plans. You're backing up the start of the plans a certain number of days, because you can start it, and overlap the process somewhat. Okay, I like to use lasagna as a way of relating critical path method scheduling, because I didn't even know it, but in college I started learning critical path method scheduling when one day my mom was at work and I was actually off for the summer, and it was her birthday on July 16th, and I said, I should be making mom dinner or something she shouldn't have to cook on her birthday. And hey, what better meal to make in the middle of July than lasagna? So I dug out the old Gasparilla cookbook that my mom had, and I followed the recipe as close. I wasn't a great cook, but I could follow instructions, and I followed the recipe, and it took forever because I did it in a linear fashion. I was just getting introduced into CPM without really knowing it. I did everything in linear fashion. First, I did the prep work. I cut the onions, I cut the garlic up, I browned the meat, and basically got the sauce ready to simmer. Then when I finished that, I simmered the red sauce for 60 minutes, just like it said in the recipe. And then after that was done, I said, okay, what's next? And they had a special little recipe for a cheese sauce that was kind of like an Alfredo sauce. Not like most sane people where you just take a tub of ricotta and use it. I made that special. And then it takes time. Then I put the water on and boiled the noodles, and then it took about 15 minutes to assemble, and then 30 minutes to bake. All told, you add these up, and it's about 3 hours and 15 minutes. And I think I snuck a nap or 2 in there somewhere, so it probably was around 4.5 hours in reality. Well, the lasagna was a big hit, and several family events after I was voluntold to make the lasagna, but I got a little bit sophisticated without even knowing I was doing CPM. I shortened the overall process from beginning to end by overlapping some of the activities. In this case, it was the cheese sauce and the boiling of the noodles. Pretty much the red sauce just simmers itself once you get it started. So once you get that started, you just put on a pot of water and start the water going for the noodles, and then you can pretty much dedicate to the labor-intensive making of cheese sauce. What I didn't realize I was doing at the time is I was creating 3 paths on my schedule. And in doing so, I allowed myself a little bit of nap time, because these 2 activities could slide to the right. And you're going to get a little bonus linguistics lesson today. In the South, slide is a 2-syllable word. Say slide. And here's my made-up term. I call this local flow, because it doesn't necessarily relate to the overall project flow, but it just gives you a little bit of time in here for these activities. The red sauce the finish is butt up against the assembling of the lasagna. So you don't have that little bit of local float there, but the cheese sauce can slide to the right and without any impacts to the schedule, and so can the boiling of the noodles, which of course means the chef gets to take a nap. And as I said before, the red sauce though is a different animal. It is, wait for it, it is critical that the red sauce start and begin on time, because if it moves to the right, or if this bar stretches and you have to add more time, then it's going to push these later events farther into the future, and that's something you don't want. Okay, well, let's see what happens if the chef elects to take that nap. Let's see graphically what happens. Okay, everybody on 3 say slide. 1, 2, 3. Slide. Okay, well, that was a nice nap, but you have to pay the price here a little bit, because now the cheese sauce and boiling of the noodles are all 3 on a critical path, because they're all 3 butt up against this lasagna. And if any of these go long, any of these 3 now go long, it's going to start pushing these other events out into the future. So it's best to save up your local float if you can. Okay, relating this to the DOT world, the prep work is like preparing the 60% plans and reviewing as well. I'm sure Mr. Know-It-All is going to say, hey, you got to review them, and before you go on to these other things, you got to address all the comments. Well, let's say you prepare the plans, you get them reviewed, you address all the comments, and then you go into 3 paths, the right-of-way acquisition, the environmental permits, and the utility coordination. All 3 are pretty much happening at the same time and overlapping each other. And not to forget our friends in PD&E, the reevaluation is happening at the same time. All 3 of these come together in the end, and in the PS&E process, we're assembling our plans, much like we're assembling our lasagna. And then after that's done, is the baking is kind of like the advertisement, which I guess makes construction is like eating the lasagna. Look out for the supplemental if somebody finds the bay leaf in there that you put in the sauce. Okay, the next slide coming up, you're going to accuse me of putting clickbait in the presentation, because it's one of those, you're not going to believe this kind of statements. A little bit shock value there. Let's go ahead. But I assure you, I'm not putting clickbait in this presentation. I'm not making advertisement money by doing so. Okay, here it is. A CPM schedule is not 1, not 2, but it's actually 3 schedules kind of working together. And this is what makes critical path method scheduling great and interesting. You need this level of complexity because of all the stuff we have going on, and recognizing things don't always happen exactly when we think they're going to do it, and so you have to be able to gauge the effect on the overall schedule. Okay, the first schedule is the early schedule. This doesn't mean you're doing things ahead of time necessarily. It just means you're doing it at the earliest possible time, based on all the times that you said things are going to take. You said phase 1 plans are going to take 30 working days. You said permits are going to take 3 months. You said drainage design is going to take 4 months. So based on all that and all the relationships you set up, this is the earliest you can do that. And I use our friend the nerd here, because we all know somebody in high school we were assigned a science project, and the nerd did it that first weekend, even though it wasn't due for like a month. Okay, there's also the late schedule. I once had a supervisor who said, why are we talking about a late schedule? Why are we talking about late finishes and late starts? I mean, we don't want to do things late. Well, it doesn't really mean late. It just means the latest it can possibly be without being late. And I use Ed McMahon, and there are any millennials out there, and you're Googling Ed McMahon ad plus Christmas Eve shopping, because Ed McMahon was the sidekick on The Tonight Show years ago. and he would tell a story every year about how he did all his Christmas shopping on Christmas Eve, which is okay if you're a rich TV star, because you go into the store on Christmas Eve and the only thing that's left is a broken Chia Pet and a $4,000 sweater. I think Ed can afford to buy the $4,000 sweater. And then there's reality. Reality is what actually happens. And if you've looked at any scheduling reports, CPM reports, you've probably seen reference to actual, or you've seen the letter A next to the dates. That means it actually happened. And it's usually in the past. It means last Tuesday, the plans were submitted. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's not speculation about what's coming. It actually happened. And here's two of our fine District 7 project managers. Mary Sheets has unfortunately left us and gone on to greener pastures, but Manny Santos is still with us, and they symbolize the actual achieved by hardworking project managers. Okay, here's a pop quiz. Is this an early schedule? Is this a late schedule? Or is this an actual schedule? If you answered yes, yes, and yes, then you would be correct, because the early schedule, the late schedule, and the actual schedule are, as the prosecuting attorney said in My Cousin Vinny, identical. And when I say identical, that means the late schedule, the early schedule, the actual schedule, the length of the activity bars are all the same. The connectors, the relationship connectors are all the same. It's just, there's like a template. But the only difference is between it, or the difference, one of the major differences is every project has like an ultimate set of boundaries. Like, for example, the earliest that you can start your process of making lasagna is the return from the market. Now, I've seen a lot of people doing things they shouldn't do in cars, like texting and things like that, and eating and whatnot, but I've never seen anybody chopping onions and chopping garlic and browning meat. So I'm gonna assume that this is pretty much the absolute earliest that you can make this happen. So let's take this generic schedule and slide it to the left. Now this is an early schedule because it illustrates in time. Remember, time is going from left to right. This is the earliest that these things can happen, assuming that all these activities take as long as we've said that they're going to take, which typically they don't, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. We're just we're kind of like giving our best estimate at this point in the game. And by the way, the return from the market, I would equate to DOT land as the notice to proceed for the design consultant or the designer. Now the end ultimate restraint in the lasagna process is supper time. This is when people are there, they're hungry, and they want to eat. Can anybody tell me what the end constraint in DOT world would be? If you said letting, then you got it right. Give yourself a big gold star. Okay. So since the early schedule and the late schedule are identical in shape and size, let's copy paste the early schedule and stick it to the far to the right, or as late in time, against this wall as we can. And there's our friend the nerd by his early schedule, and there's our friend Ed McMahon by the late schedule. Okay, what about reality? Well, reality falls somewhere between the two, hopefully. It may not. It may be a little bit sooner, or maybe a little bit later. But let's take a look at, remember our critical path here? And our critical path here, well, if you take any point on our critical path, let's say the finish, the early finish here for the red sauce and the late finish for the red sauce. The distance between the two, and remember, distance and time are related here. You know, you might be measuring, you might slap a ruler on here and measure this in inches, but it's also, you could make a special ruler and measure it in minutes in the case of lasagna, or days in the case of your project. Anyway, the difference between that late date and that early date are your project float. And you're hoping that reality falls somewhere in between there. Hopefully closer to the early. You want to hang with the nerd if you can, and not with Ed McMahon. And this is our CPM. I call it our CPM cone of uncertainty, because you're predicting that it's going to happen somewhere in this area. This stuff could go a little bit quicker, or maybe it could happen a little bit outside the cone, just like with the hurricanes, or it could happen, you know, a little bit outside the cone on the late side, which you don't want, because then you're not going to make your schedule. Now you can take any 2 points on the critical path and to measure the project float. And you've probably seen in schedule reports certain activities, they all have the same number of positive float, and that's the project float. Like, for example, this is the finish of assembling the lasagna. This is the early date, and there's the late date there. Now this is an example graphically of a project which has positive float, which is a good thing. When you have positive float, it means that your late date is to the right or later in time than your early date. And there's our friend local float, and this shows you how local float relates to the overall project float. And it also, if you've ever looked at the schedule report, you've probably noticed that there were different float numbers, and you're like, why is there different numbers of float? Well, the common number you're seeing a lot of is the critical path float, the project float, and the other numbers are the local float. And remember, these little things can kind of slide to the left, to the right there if need be. Okay. So how do we get into trouble? What's it look like when we get into trouble? What happens if the chef he starts the red sauce and he takes that nap? What if he doesn't wake up on time? Let's see what happens. Okay, your early schedule, because this time bar is increased, and because no one was there to stop it from growing, it's pushing your early schedule into the brick wall. And you have negative float because the early date is actually later than the late date, and vice versa. So if you've ever looked at a scheduling report and you've seen dates and you're saying, why are the early dates later than the late dates? Well, basically your early schedule has been crashed into your letting wall, which is not a good thing. Okay, here's the answers to the quiz. Remember, schedules are living and breathing things. Those activity bars, even though you tell it on day one that, you know, phase 2 plans are going to take 45 days, that almost never happens. It's like what I call the line of safety in the cone of uncertainty for hurricanes. I live in Tampa, and that center line of the cone has gone through Tampa so many times, and without the hurricane actually going through there, because it's just our best prediction of what it's going to happen. Usually that 45-day activity, it might take 40 days or 39 days. It might take 47 days, but it's never going to take that actual amount. So both the early date and the late schedules, that template, they're kind of breathing. It's like a heartbeat. They're kind of swelling and contracting. And if something swells in the beginning and then takes a little bit longer, then something else may be less in the future, and that's usually what saves us. Okay, remember the KISS principle. Keep it simple, silly. Let's go back real quick and look at the hot mess. Okay, unfortunately, that ship has kind of sailed for us because we as project manager are given this template. But there's nothing that says that, you know, maybe you couldn't somehow acquire a copy of Primavera yourself and make an alternate schedule that's of your own doing. Or you could have ask your schedule doctors, as I call them, at your office to do that for you, to do like a parallel schedule that's for your own use. It's a little bit simpler. Okay, on day one, you're going to have to calibrate that template because the schedule is different for every, even though we use a generic template and a lot of things, a lot of relationships are the same. We have to check and see if the relationship are actually valid for the project that we're working on. Okay, let's go back and take a look at the washer dryer example. Okay, we were doing a little bit of calibration when we did this. Okay, we were saying that was not a valid relationship before, and then we fixed the relationship to what it should be. And now, right now, Mr. Know-it-all is out there thinking, hey, genius, you do realize that it takes about half as long to wash a load of clothes as it does to dry a load of clothes. Well, that's a very good point. You can actually take this bar and probably cut it in half, and that would be more accurate. And this is this lets me give the opportunity to tell you what my nerd fantasy is. And in my next house, I'm going to have 2 dryers, so that as you know, when that second load of wash comes out, normally when the second load of wash comes out, if you're doing right after another, the first load is halfway through the drying cycle, so you have to wait. So I'm going to have 2 dryers. That way I can cut this time bar for the drying in half. Make sure those relationships are valid. If you're seeing negative float at the beginning or any time during your schedule, it could mean that the durations or the relationships just need changing. Some people cheat on this, and I'm just going to warn you. I'm not going to waggle my finger at anybody, but some people will simply unhook relationships to get rid of negative float, or sometimes people just shorten time bars without asking the people that are responsible for the particular activities. I would caution against doing that because it could end up biting you at the end. Also, remove activities that don't apply, but be careful in doing so. If you have like a railroad activity and there's no railroad within 10 miles of your project, you can pretty safely remove the railroad from there. I've always said that, you know, if you don't have right-of-way on your project, you can take that off, but you got to be real careful because every once in a while you find out in the process that you have to get a corner clip or a parcel somewhere. So I'd be real careful about removing that. If there are no utilities on your project, which would be extremely rare, I think you could probably safely remove that. Remember that float is equal to fluff. And remember that the schedule stew has many chefs, not just the project manager. There's the people reviewing, there's the people acquiring right-of-way, there's people clearing utilities, people getting environmental permits. All these people have to report to the schedule when they think things are going to happen. And you need to remind all these schedule chefs that the project float is shared. If they see 10 days of positive float on their activity or 20 days or whatever it is, please remind them that that's the rate pool for everybody. They don't each have 10 days, so they don't want to eat into the positive float. Back when I was in District 1 in a production meeting, there was a gentleman whose activity, they asked him if he was you gonna get that done on time, and he says, you know, I'm gonna meet that late date. In other words, he was wanting to be Ed McMahon, and somebody in the room said, no, I think you need to try to be the nerd, because if you're Ed McMahon, then basically you've eaten all the positive float, and everything has to be perfect from there on out to meet the schedule. Good things bear repeating. Really, project float is shared, not individually owned. Now, as a project manager or somebody who runs a schedule, you must practice forgiveness and ask for accurate start-finish prediction. In other words, don't put the individual fluff in there. If they think it's going to be delivered, their activity is going to be completed on Tuesday, they should say Tuesday and not Friday. And if it does come out to be Thursday or Friday, hey, create a culture of, that lets them be honest with you by, don't dump on them, because they're helping you if they're honest. It's okay to give what I call verbal float to your director or to your boss. In other words, if you're promised something on Tuesday, you can say, hey boss, it's going to be there by Friday. Nothing wrong with doing that, just to be safe. But when it comes to reporting to the project manager schedule, to the CPM schedule, do what you really think it's going to be. The float's in there, and everybody's sharing that float or that fluff, so it's there. That life ring is there for everybody, so don't worry about being as accurate as possible. Good things do bear repeating. If it's on Tuesday, say Tuesday. Okay, crunching or crashing the schedule. Crashing is not what we saw before, where the early schedule went into the brick wall. This is when you need to compress your schedule. In other words, you need to advance the project, and of course, this never happens in DOT, does it? Hold for laughter. Imagine, if you will, a big hand over here and a big hand over here, and the two hands are coming together to compress this process, and this of course happens all the time in our world. Okay, let's take our lasagna example once again. What if feeling a little lazy today, I don't want to go through the whole process. Well, I could take this red sauce, instead of simmering it for 60 minutes, I could stick it in the microwave for 15 minutes. And doing the quick math, 60 minus 15, does that save us 45 minutes? Well, let's take a look. Well, in this case, it saved us only 30 minutes, and here's why. You have these other parallel events here that you need to be concerned about. Yeah, this is no longer, the end of the simmering of the red sauce is no longer butt up against the assemble lasagna activity, but these two activities are here. So when you're compressing, and this is what I love about CPM schedule and the graphical representation, is you can see that, and you can imagine yourself pushing this together, and these activities saying, they're there like that thing that's stuck in the drawer. You think you're going to open your kitchen drawer, and it only opens less than you think it is because something is in there stuck. Well, these are the things that are stuck in there that are keeping you from going back 45 minutes. Now, here's a real-life example of a project I was helping a project manager with in District 7. We were asked to compress a schedule a couple of years ago. So, like I said, I'm a schedule nerd, and I like to draw by hand and draw the activities and the little relationship connectors. You can see them here. Here's the activity bars. And I went a step further, and I took a highlighter, and the things that DOT does, I highlighted in green, and the things that our consultant does, I highlighted in yellow. And the reason that's significant is that consultants can double time it a lot easier than we can. They can hire extra people, they can rely on their sub-consultants, they can do what it takes to get things done. So these are the time bars that we looked at shrinking, were the ones done by the consultant, and then we kind of left the ones that the DOT folks were done at the length it was supposed to do. This particular one was producing right-of-way maps, and our right-of-way folks, and this was late in the year, and the right-of-way manager was saying, hey, I got folks that are wanting to take off for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and so we can't compress. We have to leave things as they are. So in order to move in, the letting is way over here. In order to move all this in, here's a 268 date. we reduced the yellow bars, we compressed it in, but then, just like before, we have this other parallel activity, and this is the reevaluation for PD&E. We realized that, you know, we can do all the compressing here we want, but we can't compress the overall schedule without making sure this bar is reduced too. So we went down to PD&E with our hat in our hand, and we said, hey, can you reduce this? You got 120 days. Can you do it in like 90 days, or, you know, can you do the review in 35 days instead of 45 days? And they said yes, and so we were able to reduce, you know, the schedule. But just realize, and let me jump back here real quick to the hot mess to show you another little real-life example. Here's a critical activity, here's a time bar, and here's a whole bunch of other little activities that are running in parallel. So when you have a situation like that and you're trying to compress this, you know, you got to compress these as well, because they're there too, and they're going to, you know, you're going to have to compress everything. So it's not as simple as just reducing days on one particular event. Okay, remember in CPM schedule land, the number of days you see is actually the number of weekdays or work days, Monday through Friday. So that means there's 5 days in a week. There's 21-ish days in a month. So if you have an activity with 90 days, that's not 3 months, that's about 4 1/4 months. 260 days is equal to roughly a year in CPM land. And here's another one of my made-up terms that you can use to float in front of the real experts. Hidden float. Hidden float is what consultants have known for years, and more DOT people are finding out, are called nights and weekends. Okay, if you have your negative float in your schedule, don't worry about it. You know, it's a gauge, and it's helping you to fix things. You may simply need to do a recalibration of your schedule. It may not be that you're truly behind or not. I use the analogy, if you're driving out of the parking lot tonight and your speedometer says you're going 200 miles an hour, you're not going to go to the nearest FHP station and turn yourself in. You're going to take it to the shop and say, hey, I was going like 20, and it says I'm going 200. Make sure those relationships, like with the washer dryer, make sure they're valid. Make sure the durations are valid. It only takes half as long, genius, to wash a load of clothes than to dry it. Jimmy Buffett once said, one of the true joys in life is when you get a pair of jeans out of the washer and you reach down inside and there's a $10 bill that you didn't know you had, and it's all warm and soft, and you've got a hankering for ice cream, and there's an ice cream shop right around the corner. Well, likewise in CPM land, if you've got negative float, you need to check all your activities and make sure if something has actually happened, if the consultant submitted plans, but you haven't told the schedule that they submitted plans, or somebody hasn't told the schedule, then the schedule doesn't know. So if you go and input those, that'll clear up probably most of your negative float issues. Let's go back real quick here and take a look at the example of when the chef cooking lasagna took a nap. What would happen if the chef took the nap and he woke up on time, but he forgot to tell the schedule? Let's take a look. Same darn thing as far as the schedule is concerned, because the schedule doesn't know and you haven't told it, it assumes you're still sleeping, and you get into your negative float situation. So always make sure you're taking credit where credit is due, and check to make sure that you've taken credit for those events that have happened. And always get regular checkups from your schedule doctor. This is the person in production, or might be multiple people in your production management group that are that are the real schedule experts, and they can tell you about things like milestones. Remember that event that happened? If you take that event, and we're knowing that schedules are living, breathing things, and things are sliding around there. If you take one of those one-day events and you nail it to a certain date, that's a milestone, by the way. And there's finish-based milestones and start-based milestones, and they can tell you about things like that I haven't covered here. Mostly my purpose here today is to give you just enough so you can have an intelligent conversation with these folks. You may want to go on and learn about all the finer points of critical path method scheduling. I do think it's a very interesting area. So I would say at the very least, have a conversation with your schedule doctors about some of the things, and they'll be very impressed when you talk about a finish-to-finish relationship with a -3 lag. And they produce reports, of course, that list all the relationships in your schedule. So you can kind of take a look at it, and you can ask them to produce the Gantt chart. Even, now that you've got a little experience, the hot mess, probably not as intimidating, because like I said, all it is all these little lasagna things over and over again. So you can kind of get a feel. You can kind of, just take a glance and see which activities are overlapping each other, and you can kind of see what's controlling, which events are controlling which other ones, and kind of get a better feel for what's going on.